chartered new industries, and commissioned a railway to the Black Sea. But his crowning achievement would be to liberate Russia's serfs from centuries of bondage. The emperor became convinced a nation built on slavery could never compete in the industrial age.
Liberalism, private enterprise, rule of law, constitutional assemblies, these are the wave of the future. And it was considered by Alexander himself that modernization was incompatible with serfdom.
Conservative nobles vehemently opposed emancipation. Without free labor, they warned, their fortunes would evaporate and the Russian economy collapse. But Alexander saw no option to emancipation.
He believes that it's a way to save the autocracy. He makes a famous speech to the nobility in which he declares that either we emancipate the serfs from above or they will emancipate themselves from below.
In 1861, 2 years before U.S. President Abraham Lincoln freed America's slaves, Tsar Alexander signed the Emancipation Manifesto.
We have resolved to execute this task. The serfs will receive in time the full rights of free rural inhabitants.
Originally, the emancipation was greeted as a great and heroic act. Alexander II was hailed as the Tsar Liberator, and he wore this title with pride through the rest of his life. But very quickly, people had become disappointed with the actual effects of the emancipation. The peasants had to buy their land from the landlords at very high prices, which put the peasants into deep debt.
The emperor had set the peasants free, and yet they were poorer than ever. Agricultural production plummeted, and as many had feared, Russia's economy teetered on collapse. The revolutionary underground began to call for radical action.
Small but significant sections of Russian educated society are calling for the overthrow not just of the monarchy, but of private property and of marriage. Well, you know, advocating republicanism, socialism and free love in the reign of Queen Victoria in the 1860s is pretty radical. Not at all surprisingly, these people turn against the Tsarist regime.
Some called for elections and free land. Others called for blood, the blood of the Tsar. They called themselves Narodnaya Volya, the people's will. The tight-knit terrorist ring was led by a woman, Sofia Perovskaya.
She's a child of privilege. Her father was the governor general of St. Petersburg. This is one of the most powerful positions in the entire empire. Yet she turns into a revolutionary who's dedicated to killing the Tsar. And in fact, this is one of the paradoxes of Russian history, of course. That is that it's the most privileged stratum in society that is producing the revolutionaries dedicated to overthrowing this regime.
We believe in the destruction of the most harmful persons in the government to raise belief in the revolution and build a body accustomed to warfare.
Purging society with Tsarist blood, Sofia and her comrades believed, was the only way a new, free land would arise. In 1879, Sofia's death squad launched a campaign to assassinate Russia's leading progressive, Tsar Alexander II. November 1879, the Imperial Express approached Moscow. A bomb shattered the Tsar's carriage. Alexander escaped death by traveling ahead on an earlier train. February 1880. As the royal family headed for dinner, the Winter Palace dining room exploded. Dozens of servants and guards were maimed and killed. Despite devoting his reign to reform, the Tsar found himself hunted by assassins.
Am I a wild beast that they should hound me to death?
Can you imagine someone going into the White House and blowing up, setting off a bomb that kills 13 people? This would have been the psychological effect that this had on the Tsar's family and on really all of society and public opinion.
A rumor that Alexander was on the way could clear the streets of bystanders or empty a theater. Yet despite the terror campaign, the emperor still championed reform. He announced plans for a new legislative council. For the first time in Russian history, a Tsar proposed to share his power. Sunday, March 1st, 1881. Tsar Alexander II planned to publish his proposed balance of power with his new legislature on Tuesday morning. In 48 hours, Russia would be on the long road to parliamentary rule. But for the terrorists of the Narodnaya Volya, reform could only start with the death of the Tsar. Sofia Perovskaya and her comrades had staked out the route Alexander took to the palace that Sunday afternoon. With the drop of her kerchief, their revolution was on. Failure had taught the assassins the Tsar might escape one suicide bomber. Sofia brought 4.
And one of the revolutionaries throws a grenade, and it explodes, but the Tsar's carriage is actually bulletproof. It was a gift from Napoleon III of France. It protected the Tsar, but then the Tsar made a fatal mistake. He got out of the carriage to tend to the wounded, and a second revolutionary had a second grenade.
Skull shattered, legs blown off, Emperor Alexander Nikolaevich Romanov asked to go home to the Winter Palace, where the Tsar Liberator bled to death.
The revolutionaries believe that a new era has begun, that the people have been liberated. They truly believe this. And it doesn't take very long before they find out that, in fact, the opposite has occurred.
Tsarist repression returned with a vengeance. The murdered Tsar's son and heir, Emperor Alexander III, rounded up Sofia and her accomplices and had them hanged. On the site of his father's assassination, the new Tsar raised a masterwork of Russian architecture, the Church of the Savior on Spilled Blood. But the crown jewel of his father's reign, the Tsar Liberator's plans to share power with a legislature, he rejected as folly. Under the despotic new Tsar Alexander, reform was finished.
Starting in 1881, what you have is a recoiling from any of the progress, political, economic, social progress that had occurred in the rest of Europe. And to close the curtain like that meant that you were opening the door to revolution.
6 years later, remnants of the Narodnaya Volya plotted to kill the new Tsar. Their plans were discovered and the ringleaders were hanged. One of the executed revolutionaries, Alexander Ulyanov, left behind a devoted younger brother, Vladimir. Inspired by his elder brother, Vladimir Ulyanov would soon remake Russia under his revolutionary nom de guerre, Lenin. In 1894, Russia was a land hurtling into the future. In 30 years, the empire had built nearly 30,000 miles of railway, a rate that eclipsed any other nation. Industrial output was soaring. Peasants were flocking to new jobs in the factories, turning provincial towns into crowded urban centers.
But as Russia industrialized, a working class emerges in the big cities, especially in Moscow, in St. Petersburg, in Kiev. And at the same time, Marxist ideas begin to trickle into Russia.
The capital of St. Petersburg was now home to 1 million souls, including a young radical lawyer, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, Lenin. Like many revolutionaries, Vladimir Ulyanov was a child of Russia's educated elite, the son of a provincial school superintendent. His brother's execution for revolutionary crimes propelled Lenin into the radical struggle. In 1893, he came to St. Petersburg